It was about the 9th day of March in the year 401 BC that the army of Cyrus began to set forward. Cyrus was commander-in-chief of the whole army, but the two divisions were kept entirely separate, each under its own officers. The Asiatic troops, who numbered 100,000, were under the command of Arius, one of the most distinguished of the Persian supporters of Cyrus. The Hellene force, which consisted of 13,000 men and was afterward increased by another 1,000, was composed of a number of different companies, each commanded by the general who had raised it, and smaller or larger according to his success in getting recruits. Under the generals were captains, who each had command of 100 men, and whose numbers consequently varied in each company with the number of the soldiers. Of the Persian troops, the most brilliant and useful were the cavalry. The Persians had long been famous for their skill and activity as horsemen. They were also excellent archers and could draw their long bows at full gallop with as accurate an aim as if they were standing still and undisturbed on solid ground. Among the Hellenes, on the contrary, the most useful, and at the same time the most numerous, were the hoplites or heavy infantry. There were no cavalry, and in the whole army, only 40 mounted men, nearly all of whom were officers. The hoplites wore a helmet, breastplate, and greaves of iron, and carried an oval shield of oxhide overlaid with metal, which protected them from the mouth to the ankles. On its inner side the shield had a handle for holding it, and a strap wide enough for a shoulder belt was attached to it at each end, so that it could be carried over the back. This was the usual way of carrying it on the march, when the enemy was known to be in the neighborhood, so that it was necessary to have the shield at hand, but not when the soldiers were engaged in actual fighting. For weapons of attack, they carried a spear measuring from 7 to 8 feet in length, made of strong wood with a solid iron point, and a short sword, or curved saber. None but fine strong men could enter the ranks of the hoplites, for the full weight of the armor and weapons that they had to carry was no less than 70 pounds. The light infantry were armed quite differently. They had but one weapon of defense, a shield which was only 2 feet in length. Besides this, they had little to carry but their clothes, for they were practically a troop of foot cavalry, and it was necessary that they should be very active and able both to advance and retreat with extreme rapidity. According to their weapons of attack, they were subdivided into troops of lancers, archers, and slingers. The lancers carried several light javelins, from 3 to 4 feet in length, the archers carried bows and arrows, and the slingers carried slings, with which they hurled stones or leaden bullets at the enemy. And now the great host is well on its way. Try to imagine the dense, suffocating clouds of dust that must have been raised by the progress of such an army. Supposing the troops to have marched 10 abreast, leading one pace between each rank, the barbarian army would have formed a procession more than 3 miles long, and the Hellene army would have covered about a third of a mile more. Besides this, there was the long train of baggage wagons, the great droves of animals brought for slaughter, the numberless beasts of burden, and the crowds of people who in some capacity or other followed the army, but did not march in the ranks. Even in the Hellene army, which in comparison with the barbarian force was but scantily provided with camp followers, there were great numbers of slaves whose duty it was to pitch the tents, to prepare the food, and to attend generally to the comfort of the troops. The tents and utensils were packed with the other luggage in wagons which the slaves drove, or piled on the backs of transport animals which the slaves led. Many of the Hellene officers, moreover, and even some of the private soldiers, had brought their own slaves to wait upon them and to carry their heavy shields and helmets when there was no likelihood of their being attacked on the march. Behind these came a number of provision dealers and other merchants, who brought goods of all kinds to sell to the troops, and who were always ready to buy from them any spoil that they might have an opportunity of taking. Still further in the rear were trumpeters, heralds, sacrificing priests, soothsayers, and surgeons. But the Hellene camp followers were outnumbered 100 times by the followers of the barbarian army. For in addition to the other slaves, the luxurious Persian lords had brought with them their cooks, their bakers, and all manner of personal attendants, besides enormous tents in which to house the many members of their households who accompanied them to the war. The complete length of the procession formed by the army and its retinue was nothing short of 6 miles. This immense multitude, great enough to people a good-sized town, required every day to be fed, either by buying such provisions as could be obtained on the spot, when the country through which they were marching was fruitful and well-peopled, or, when the country was waste and desolate, by falling back upon the stores which they had brought with them. These stores they were careful to renew whenever there was an opportunity of doing so. In the barbarian army, the officers were entrusted with the duty of providing food for the troops, and seeing that each man received every day his due portion of bread, meat, and wine. In the Hellene army, the men catered for themselves, for their pay was given them in money instead of food. The ordinary pay of a Hellene soldier was 1 daric a month, and out of this he was expected to provide his own weapons. The captains received twice as much as the private soldiers, and the generals, 4 times as much. To us, such a sum appears a very miserable pittance, but it must be remembered that in those days the value of money was far greater than it is now. Moreover, all alike, whether officers or privates, might count upon a good share of booty from the enemy's country. The Hellenes had now been for some considerable time in the service of Cyrus, and hitherto he had not failed to pay them punctually every month. But the enormous expenses incurred in starting the expedition had for the moment completely drained his treasury, and now, 2 months after the departure from Sardis, he was still unable to give them any money, although their pay was by this time 3 months in arrear. It was a painful and embarrassing situation, and he felt it the more keenly because he had always been accustomed to give to those whom he employed more, rather than less, than he had promised them. For a time, the soldiers had been content to wait, for they had mostly some money of their own to fall back upon. But gradually their savings were becoming exhausted, and they were obliged to remind Cyrus of his debt. At first, they did this modestly, but, as time went on, they became more and more persistent, and now whole bands of them were constantly gathered around his tent, clamoring for their pay. From this unpleasant position Cyrus was rescued by help that came to him from an unexpected quarter. Just at this time, he received a visit from the Princess Epyaxa, wife of Prince Cynesis, who was the ruler of Cilicia, a province of the Persian Empire included in the satrapy of Cyrus. The princess had made a long journey in order to meet Cyrus at this point, and she had not come empty-handed. The large sum of money that she brought with her could not have arrived at a more welcome moment, and it was sufficient to enable Cyrus to distribute 4 months' pay to the Hellene soldiers and yet reserve a considerable sum for the next time of necessity. Cyrus was now approaching the province of Cilicia, and for some days Epyaxa accompanied his march. One day she expressed a wish that he would draw up his whole army before her, so that she might see it at its full strength. Accordingly, when they came to some open country suitable for the purpose, Cyrus proceeded to gratify her wish and ordered the troops to be drawn up in battle array, that he might review them in the company of the princess. Side by side they passed along the ranks, the princess in a woman's chariot shaded by curtains that could be drawn close or open wide at pleasure, Cyrus in a man's chariot. First they reviewed the barbarian army with its endless ranks of cavalry and foot soldiers. Then they came to the Hellene troops, who were stationed opposite. In point of numbers, the Hellenes could not compare with the barbarians, but their appearance was far more imposing, so noble and spirited was their bearing, so proud and firm their step. They were dressed in purple tunics, with brass greaves and helmets, and carried bright, polished shields that glittered in the sunshine. After having driven slowly past them, Cyrus sent word to beg that the hoplites would advance, as if they were in battle, and about to charge. In answer to his request, the trumpeters gave a signal, and, on hearing it, the hoplites covered themselves with their great shields, and lowered their long, powerful spears as if they saw the enemy before them. Then the war cry was sounded forth, and the hoplites began to advance, marching faster and faster, until their pace was like a whirlwind, carrying everything before it. The barbarians were seized with panic, for the charge had every appearance of being in earnest. The princess sprang from her chariot and ran away as fast as she was able. The merchants left their wares and, like the rest, sought refuge in flight, and meanwhile the Hellenes returned, laughing, to their tents. When the princess had recovered from her fright, she could not sufficiently praise the gallant bearing of the Hellene troops, and as for Cyrus, his heart bounded with joy at the thought of the impression they would make upon his enemies when they should confront them in the field of battle. Soon after this, the army reached the country of the Lycaonians, who were no less notorious than the Pisidians for their constant raids upon the territory of their neighbors. Cyrus desired the Hellenes to plunder their country, and thus gained a double advantage. On the one hand, he was able to punish the robbers and, on the other, he could in this way provide some spoil for his Hellene troops, an arrangement with which they were entirely satisfied. The army was now within a few days' march of Cilicia, and the princess returned to her home by a short route under the escort of a company of Hellene soldiers, while the main part of the army followed by a longer but easier way. Cyrus was prepared to find Prince Cynesis less disposed than his wife to receive him with open arms. As a subject of Artaxerxes the great king, it would be his duty to prevent Cyrus the rebel from advancing through his country. This he could easily do, for the entrance to Cilicia was by a road so steep and narrow that a very small number of men could hold it against an army of invaders. But the difficulty had been foreseen, and, before leaving Sardis, Cyrus had fitted out a fleet which had followed him around the coast of Asia Minor, and was now in readiness to land soldiers on the further side of the mountains, so that they might fall upon the enemy in the rear. It happened, however, that the presence of the fleet was sufficient, and that it was not necessary to land the soldiers. The prince had indeed taken possession of the heights commanding the road by which Cyrus must enter, but, when he found that not only were the mountains behind him occupied by the Hellene soldiers who had accompanied his wife to her home, but that moreover the troops who were preparing to disembark from the fleet would also be in his rear, he abandoned all idea of defending it. And thus Cyrus was able to pass over the mountains unhindered and enter the city of Tarsus without further difficulty. Cyrus now invited the prince to visit him as a friend. But Cynesis answered, "I have never put myself into the power of one who is more powerful than myself, and I will not do so now." The princess, however, persuaded him to trust to the honor of Cyrus, and he finally accepted the invitation. Like his wife, he took with him a considerable sum of money to assist the rebel, and, in return, Cyrus presented him with the usual gifts offered by the Persians to persons of distinction: a horse with a golden bridle, a sword with a golden sheath, a ring, armlets, and a robe of honor. So little could the great king rely upon the loyalty of his subjects. In deciding to make his peace with Cyrus, the Cilician prince had probably considered what would be the course best calculated to forward his own interests. By occupying the mountains for a few days, he had made a display of loyalty to the great king, and having done this, he was anxious on the other hand to secure the favor of Cyrus also, in case he should be the conqueror.